In recent years, paranormal investigators have too often been the butt of the joke. As ghost hunting TV shows become more popular, they've also become increasingly more bizarre and Hollywoodized, and it's sometimes difficult to decipher what is earnest investigation and what is simply good TV. Manchester's Association for Paranormal Investigation and Training, MAPIT, was born in 1974, with the sole intention of exploring UFO phenomena being reported in the UK. It soon grew to encompass many aspects of the paranormal and supernatural, and they claim to have conducted many confidential investigations for city councils and citizens alike. Steve Mera is a member of MAPIT and a self-proclaimed skeptic. During his many years with MAPIT, he has conducted thousands of investigations, but believes that only a handful of experiences could not be explained away by rational, psychological, or scientific means. What happened in the Rochdale Poltergeist case frightened him so much that it made him question whether he was really cut out to be a paranormal investigator, and whether he would ever really be ready to face true paranormal phenomena. And this is his story. "Spooky Spills Scare Family from Home" was the headline. And Steve laughed and shook his head as he glanced at the image of the family staring sadly at a water-damaged ceiling, the dad with a mop in his hand. Sometimes even more bizarre than the paranormal is the cheesy photographs that journalists love to use for local newspapers. Something about this article interested Steve though. The Gardner family claimed that they were being mercilessly plagued by flooding in their household. So much so that their furniture and indeed quality of life was being destroyed. They claimed to have contacted the local council to help them find the source of the plumbing issues, and no one had been able to figure out how or why their house was flooding at an alarming rate. They explained to the journalist that they believed the source of the water was paranormal, caused either by a poltergeist or the deceased husband of Vera Gardner, the matriarch of the household, who believed her past husband was angry that she had remarried after his death. They went on to explain that having run out of avenues to try and find a logical reason for the flooding, they had contacted a priest. Steve sat up. This was interesting. And these were exactly the type of cases that he loved. This was a family who had suffered at the hands of something for 10 months and had exhausted all logical means of understanding what was happening in their home. Steve decided that before doing anything else, he needed to call the council to confirm some of the finer details. The council confirmed that they had been working extensively with the Gardner family. The family was made up of Vera and her second husband Jim, and her adult daughter Jeanette. Becoming increasingly intrigued by their story, Steve left his details with the council and told them to give him a call if they or the family were interested in a paranormal investigation. And 2 days later, the phone rang. The council were worried. 2 council representatives and Steve and his team sat around a boardroom table. The council relayed the story. The house was being damaged, but they could not figure out how, and they needed to determine what was actually happening in the home. Did they really believe it was a paranormal entity? Probably not, but they were concerned about how much this was costing them, and they were equally as concerned about more bad press. A little old woman opened the door to Steve and his 2 associates, Alicia and Peter. She took one look at them and promptly burst into racking sobs, trying desperately to talk through the tears. Steve tried to calm her down and explained to her that they were just here for an initial chat and a look around. The team entered the house and were immediately hit with a pungent aroma of wet dog. The house was tiny, and the council had provided plastic sheeting to protect what little belongings the family had left. The team sat down in the plastic-covered sitting room with Vera and Jim and drank endless cups of tea, while Vera settled in to tell them her story. As Vera began to talk, Steve scanned the room. There was nothing to indicate that the family had any interest in the paranormal. No paranormal books on the shelves. No indications of any spiritual leanings at all. Vera explained that she had been making sandwiches for lunch in her small kitchen when she heard the steady drip, drip, drip of water behind her. She turned, expecting to see the solitary drip of a leak from somewhere. But what she saw both alarmed and confused her. She looked up to the ceiling to see a sheen of water covering the entire space, as though the room was its own ecosystem and the ceiling was a sky covered in rain clouds. She panicked. There must be a massive leak in the piping, and then just as suddenly as it started, the rain stopped. The kitchen was soaked, but the ceiling was bone dry, as though the rain had formed and fallen from mid-air. Vera did what anyone would have done in her position, and called the council to inform them of what had happened and to request a plumber. A completely thorough investigation was carried out, and the loft was found to be dry and dusty. But more bizarrely, there weren't even any pipes that ran through the ceiling. So there was absolutely no way a burst pipe could have caused the mysterious flooding. The water issues continued and seemed to spread. Large, perfect circles of condensation would appear in the centre of doors or on walls, and at one point a patch of condensation that was made up of huge water droplets appeared to shoot from one side of the room to the other, dodging backwards and forwards across the ceiling, working its way around the ceiling light fitting, as though this water were sentient. Vera and Jim were perplexed, but continued to report their observations, determined to discover what the cause of the damp was. No one was successful, and the events took a sharp turn. Jim was awoken one night to an unfamiliar sound. He paused and shook his head, trying to establish what he was hearing. And his stomach dropped when he realised that he was hearing the unmistakable slapping of footsteps roaming slowly in and out of their bedroom. What was even more strange was that the footsteps were bare feet slapping against a wooden floor. But the floors in Jim and Vera's house had all been covered in sheets of plastic. It was from this point onwards that the audible phenomena began to escalate. Vera would regularly hear knocking and scratching from inside the walls. The sounds predominantly happened at night time, but it was a sound heard during the day that heralded the time for Vera's blood to turn cold. As she was bustling around the house alone, she heard the unmistakable sound of a hoarse, rasping, gurgling cough from the room she had shared with her now dead husband. Vera knew at this moment that her deceased husband was letting her know that he was displeased with her remarrying after his death. Vera would lay in bed and listen to the dry, rasping cough coming from the dark corner of her bedroom, and couldn't count the amount of times her and Jim had checked the house from top to bottom, anticipating an intruder. During these searches, Vera and Jim would be followed by the distinct smell of tobacco that had been rolled with licorice papers. The sounds and knocking continued, and Vera would often hear a disembodied whistling around the house. Soon small objects were being flung around at an alarming speed. Teacups would fly off the table in front of them and shatter at the other side of the room, and objects would disappear only to reappear randomly in completely strange places. Steve and his team listened quietly, and had now decided that they were definitely willing to do an investigation. As Vera and Jim were telling their tale, Steve had slipped an audio recorder beneath a cushion in the sitting room, and the team left the home. This was one of Steve's age-old tricks, and he had discovered hoaxes numerous times by doing this. The conversation that alleged haunting victims had immediately after the team left were always very telling. Around 20 minutes after the team had left, Steve knocked again on the door and explained to Vera that he had left a piece of equipment behind. Sitting in the van, Steve and the team listened to the recording. Vera, audibly upset, could be heard saying, "But do you think they'll be able to help us?" When the team returned to the house 2 weeks later, the first thing they decided to do was climb into the loft to ensure that there really were no signs of leaking. The loft was bone dry, and the team, Vera and Jim, sat in the kitchen drinking tea and discussing the plan of action for the investigation. Jeanette was the adult daughter of Vera and her deceased husband, and she had an intellectual disability. She lived at home happily with her mum and stepdad, but wasn't remotely interested in discussing the happenings with the investigators. Jeanette appeared at the kitchen door and simply said, "It's happening again." The team followed her to the living room, where she pointed to a shimmering puddle on the ceiling. They watched as the puddle pulsated and sparkled. A long tendril of water would extend from the puddle almost like an appendage that would drag the rest of the water along with it. The team watched in amazement, and Steve managed to gather himself enough to scoop a few drops of the water into a plastic bottle. For a minute, the anomaly stopped and vibrated in place, and then evaporated into nothingness. The ceiling was left bone dry. The team were excited now. Whatever was happening in this little house was unlike anything they had ever seen before. No sooner had the water disappeared from the living room than Jim's voice was heard from the kitchen. "I think you guys had better come and see this." Jim was standing in the kitchen with an umbrella over his head, and it was raining. Indoors. Steve stood mouth agape as the rain fell from the ceiling like a torrential rainstorm. "How often does this happen?" Steve asked in disbelief. "A couple of times a week," Jim replied with a shrug of his shoulders. "Hence the umbrella." As the rain evaporated from the ceiling, Vera bustled into the kitchen with a mop. The team left the house and set about researching the history of both the house and the area. But they could neither find anything untoward or any similar cases involving sentient water. They didn't even know where to start with this one. When they returned to the house, Vera and her family agreed to stay away for the night, to give them some space to conduct their research. They set about filming each room so that they could have a reference point for the placement of items and took base temperature readings. Everything seemed normal. The team began their investigation as soon as possible, and specifically in the daylight. They were perfectly aware that there was no reason why paranormal events would only happen at nighttime, and equally as aware of the psychological impact of darkness on human perception. The team split up into groups and took the investigation room by room. Alicia and Steve sat in Jeanette's room, and there was nothing to report. The house was calm and quiet. There was no oppressive atmosphere and no sense of danger, no sense of anxiety. Steve stood from the bed to leave the room when he felt an icy blast on his cheek, and Alicia's voice whispered, "Are you all right, Stevie?" Steve froze and looked up at Alicia, who was stood in the doorway looking at him questioningly. The voice came from behind him, like she was standing next to his ear. And no one ever called him Stevie. The team alternated rooms. No one had heard the voice that Steve had heard, but they definitely all heard what happened next. The radio in Jeanette's room, which was unplugged, began to hiss and pop as though someone had turned it on. They converged in Jeanette's room, and the radio continued to crackle. The team stared, and as clear as day, a voice emerged from the static. "John is watching." They immediately set about trying to find a logical explanation for John, and reasoned that perhaps the radio had picked up interference from a nearby taxi or truck radios. These seemed reasonable enough explanations until they checked the radio and realised that not only was it not plugged in, but it also had no batteries in it. There was no possible way that the radio could have even turned on, let alone picked up interference from somewhere. The team continued their investigation, and Steve found himself in the back bedroom where Vera used to sleep with her previous husband. It was quiet. The investigators were each in separate rooms, listening and waiting. Slowly and steadily, a noise began to fill the air around Steve. It was a rattling, rasping breath from behind him. He sat rigidly on the bed. The breath sounded human, but Steve knew that there was no one behind him. The blood pulsed in his ears and he listened to the breath rattling. Suddenly, there was a crash. It took Steve a second to figure out what was happening, but then he realised that he was the crash. Steve found himself on the other side of the room, sprawled over the table. He didn't quite understand what had happened, but he knew he had been punched, the force of which had launched him across the room. He called out to his team and they rushed to his aid, helping him out of the house. On his back was a huge red welt that was already beginning to morph into a deep purple bruise. It took Steve 20 minutes to work up the courage to even step foot back inside the house. The investigation continued, and the evidence was overwhelming. A small statue of the Greek goddess Themis appeared in the middle of the floor, and no one could figure out where it came from. After reviewing the footage of the rooms, they could find no footage that contained the statue. Water droplets appeared in their hundreds on the kitchen door, and then disappeared, leaving the door bone dry. There was a pungent smell of flowers that appeared and reappeared in different parts of the house. When Vera and Jim arrived home the next day, the team were eager to question them further. John was indeed Vera's previous husband's name, and the small statue of Themis had been a little souvenir that they had brought home from holidays many years ago. Vera explained to the team that John had passed away in the back bedroom due to emphysema and had struggled to breathe for many years and had been confined to the bedroom. Vera also informed the team that John had a job that he loved. He was a taxi driver. Steve wanted to come back for another investigation and the family agreed. If John was indeed haunting the house, then why now? After all these years? It was time to go and speak to the local priest. Reverend Jones spoke openly to Steve about his experiences inside the house, and simply said, well, they obviously have a poltergeist. He went on to explain that he had requested an exorcism, but the church had declined, based on the idea that poltergeist events were neither location-based nor demonic, but rather they were attached to a human. It's the girl, Reverend Jones told Steve. Jeanette. In the paranormal community, there is a belief that teenage girls are often the focus of poltergeist activity. Steve had wondered whether Jeanette was the focus of the activity. Her intellectual disability left her vulnerable and childlike. But what Reverend Jones said next left Steve reeling. Jeanette had had a baby, and that baby was taken into care. She was allowed to see her little girl every 2 weeks. Originally, these visits took place in the home, but the presence of the child seemed to send the poltergeist into a frenzy, and the activity became violent. Eventually, Jeanette began visiting her daughter outside of the home instead. While still reading from the development of the story, the results from the water sample came in. In fact, the lab rang to clarify whether both samples had come from the same household, because Steve had taken a sample from the ceiling and another sample from the kitchen tap. The kitchen tap sample was normal standard tap water. The ceiling water, however, had a rate of UCSMs that was completely unheard of. UCSMs measure the electrical charge of water. Water naturally picks up a small amount of electricity as it passes through copper piping, and a reading between 70 and 110 is perfectly normal. The ceiling water had a reading of exactly 1,323. The lab couldn't explain it. Steve sat in a boardroom opposite 5 members of the Rochdale County Council. Some members visibly smirked when Steve introduced himself and had clearly come along to the meeting for the laugh. By the end of the meeting, no one was laughing. The smirks had disappeared, and the council decided to quietly move the family to a different house, in the hope that the disturbances would end. Perhaps Reverend Jones was right, and the poltergeist is attached to the person and not the household. Jeanette faced a terrible trauma that no person should have to face. So was it possible that the poltergeist activity was actually manifested by her, and it wasn't really the ghost of her dead father? Maybe it just manifested in a way that she could understand. Around 8 months after the family moved, Jim called Steve. The activity was happening again. Items were being thrown and smashed, and Steve had a hunch he knew why. He visited the family when Jeanette was out and set up some hidden cameras in the house. The cameras showed that Jeanette had been throwing items and smashing them. The family then recognised that they needed to work with Jeanette to help her to understand what had happened to her. And while there was evidence that Jeanette was responsible for the phenomena in the new household, the phenomena in the old household remains a mystery.